series of facts which had been endorsed by a jury's verdict. What happened was Victor Marchetti, one of the highest ranking officials of the CIA, to leave that organization and write a book exposing the CIA, heard when the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a committee of the Congress looking into the Kennedy and King assassinations, he heard that there was a memorandum circulating, and it was signed by Richard Helms, then the director of the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, then the head of counterintelligence for the CIA. And in essence, it said, he heard, one day we in the CIA will have to explain what E. Howard Hunt, who was a Watergate burglar, CIA operative, was doing in Dallas here on November 22nd, 63. The report indicated that Hunt had been involved in the assassination, and then went on to say, we'll either have to say that Hunt was working for us, but he didn't follow our orders, he must have done it on his own, or provide for him a plausible denial or an alibi to show falsely that he was not there. A newspaper called The Spotlight, a conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C., a national weekly, published the story. Hunt sued. Hunt got a verdict of $650,000 because the newspaper defended
against him.
No, he won. Hunt won. Oh. He filed a defamation case. The newspaper was ordered to pay $650,000 for having defamed Mr. Hunt. They didn't defend it on the basis of truth. They just said, well, there was no actual malice. We're sorry if we offended anyone. But there was an error made in the instructions to the jury by the judge. It was sent back for a new trial. The newspaper realized this was now serious. That judgment would have put them out of business. They asked me to take the case. I read the records and said, I don't defend on the basis of lack of actual malice. I'm an old-fashioned lawyer. I can prove to the satisfaction of a jury that the CIA killed President Kennedy. And if you will let me take depositions, I'll prove that. Well, this was like a kid in a candy store. For all of these years, I had had questions to ask of key officials, and I would call them and they'd hang up, or I would question them and they'd smile if the question was tough. They were all in my office in the next year. Richard Helms, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, David Phillips.
Giving depositions.
Giving depositions, and they had to answer every question, and they were under oath. And we put that all together, and then we tried the case. It was a 2-week trial, hotly contested. Both sides picked a jury. Both sides felt it was a fair, impartial jury. The jury was out for 1 hour. They came back and found for us unanimously, and then explained to the news media through the forewoman of the jury. Mr. Lane was asking us to do something very, very difficult, to conclude that our own government, or part of it, had killed our president. Yet when we looked at all of the evidence, the documents, we listened to the witnesses, we were constrained to conclude, as we did, the CIA killed President Kennedy. That's now a verdict.
Our viewers will have a hard time remembering that case, that trial.
Yeah, because it was never covered.
Never covered? Not covered at all?
Not covered at all.
Why?
I think there's a
I mean, what more monumental question of this century is there than who killed JFK?
Well, you know, when Hunt won, I don't know why, but I have some guesses. When Hunt won the first case, which was merely a defamation case where the newspaper was apologizing, that was a big, big story in the Washington Post, for example. A full page, starting on the style section, front page. When we won the case a few years ago, well, there hasn't yet been a story in the Washington Post, even saying that we won. And I don't pick up the Post every day checking for that story anymore because it's 5 years now. I don't know why, but I do know that it's clear that the media has not been representative of the American people. An issue of Newsweek just a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, on the October surprise was the cover story. It ended up by saying, we are sure there was no October surprise. Reagan, Bush, the CIA were not involved in trying to keep hostages over there. Good enough, that's their position. Then it went on to say, but despite these facts, we may not be able to convince the American people, just as the American people, for some reason which we can't fathom, still seem to believe that the Warren report was wrong and Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone assassin. Well, in Washington, D.C., in the headquarters of Newsweek, Washington Post, in New York City, New York Times headquarters, in CBS, wherever they are, they represent a tiny fraction of the American people. They are the only ones in America who believe the Warren report.
Are you trying to say there's some kind of conspiracy within the media to keep the, quote, facts, unquote, away from the American people?
For 1 year after the shots were fired here in this city, there was not a single, you're right, it's a monumental question, there was not a single network, radio or television broadcast in America, not one which permitted one word of dissent from the official version. The only way I could do local shows, local radio mostly, the only way I could reach Americans in more than one city at a time for all of 1964, a good part of 1965, was to go to Canada and broadcast on CBC, and that would go to the northern cities, Buffalo, Detroit, etc. I don't know why that is so. The longest originated story in the history of the Associated Press, now what took place when there was an AP? World War II, landing on the moon, some pretty important matters. The longest story they ever originated was an attack upon me for doubting the validity of the Warren Report. There's something wrong. The media is not meeting its responsibilities to tell the American people the facts.
Well, with all due respect, Mr. Lane, the theories, contrary theories about the contradictory theories about the assassination of JFK are a dime a dozen. Your theory that the CIA was involved, we need some facts that you could.
Sure.
You have a few more minutes to do it here.
All right. Well, first of all, they're all in the book Plausible Denial. Secondly, many of them were presented to the jury, and the jury reached a verdict. It's not a theory anymore. It's not a dime a dozen. It's the only jury verdict in America on this question.
If I may just say so, juries have been wrong before.
Yeah, the Warren Commission never said that Oswald was guilty. He had not been indicted, he had not been charged, he did not have a defense lawyer. At least all of those ordinary attributes of American law took place in this case, not in any other case dealing with this matter. Oh, an eyewitness named Marita Lorenz, who was recruited by the CIA to kill Fidel Castro, and the documents are published in the book, was recruited by the CIA, she said, by Frank Sturgis, to go from
another Watergate
figure, to go from Miami to Dallas. She went with them. There were 2 cars in the caravan filled with Cubans whose names she gave, who are organized crime in Cuba, activists, sharpshooters, with rifles with telescopic sights. They came here to Dallas 2 days before the assassination. E. Howard Hunt came into the room, was the paymaster for the organization, and later Sturgis told her what the plan was, and what they had done that day was to kill the president. That was her testimony. More than that, we have documents showing that these were given to the Warren Commission, and we finally have released them under the Freedom of Information Act, that on September 26th, the CIA was setting up a charade in Mexico City. A man was going into the Soviet embassy saying, "My name is Lee Harvey Oswald. I would like to speak to Kostakov." He used a code name, Kostak. Kostakov in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City was the KGB official in charge of assassinations. Then this man went to the Cuban embassy, said, "I want to talk to Sylvia Duran. I have to get transit visa to Cuba and then to Moscow." That was going to take place after he killed the president. This is what held Earl Warren and his colleagues hostage. Warren addressed the first staff meeting that he had of the Warren Commission. We have the minutes. He said, "We have to set aside our general principles of telling the truth. We have to set that aside. World War III is involved. 40 million people may die if the truth is out." What he had been told by the CIA is that Oswald was meeting with the KGB, with the Cubans, and then Oswald acted alone. And I don't know what's more pathetic, the fact that Warren relied upon the CIA for the truth, or his belief that the American people couldn't take it. We can now prove, and we have, documented through FBI files, Hoover's own letters, other documents, that Oswald was never in the Cuban embassy, never in the Soviet embassy. The CIA set up that charade 2 months before the assassination to hold hostage any organization which would dare to conduct an investigation, for fear if the truth came out, it would be misinterpreted. These are all documents of the government which we have secured now and published in the book.
Well, you haven't yet answered why, and you haven't yet told us about the Lee Harvey Oswald connection. Before we get into that, let's take our middle break here, and then we'll come back and talk about that. We'll be back in a moment. Our guest is attorney Mark Lane. He first became known nationwide in 1966 with his book Rush to Judgment, a challenge of the Warren Commission report. And he's making headlines again with his latest book on the Kennedy assassination, titled Plausible Denial: Was the CIA Involved in the Assassination of JFK? And of course, we've just heard him say that, in his opinion, yes, it was. But why, Mr. Lane, why did the CIA want to do away with President Kennedy?
The theory was not implausible to Robert Kennedy. The first phone call he made when informed that his brother had been killed was to McCone, the director of the CIA, and the first question he asked was, "Did the CIA kill my brother?" That was the first question he asked. We document that in the book. Now, why? John Kennedy said that the CIA has lied to me, has deceived me for the last time. He fired Allen Dulles, who later was lying to him. Dulles was later appointed by Lyndon Johnson to tell us the truth about the assassination by being appointed, as it turned out to be, the most active member of the Warren Commission. He was dissolving the CIA. He said in 1964, John Kennedy said, we're forming a new intelligence organization. Robert Kennedy was going to be the head of it. That was the end of the Central Intelligence Agency and maybe the beginning of the Kennedy dynasty. A few shots were fired here, and the Kennedy dynasty was ended. And now the CIA, for the first time in its history, has as President of the United States its former director. But there are a lot of steps in between that. And what I think is most crucial in looking at this is what the CIA was thinking when John Kennedy said he's going to destroy them. We have a book by David Phillips, who ran the Western Hemisphere for the CIA, a book by E. Howard Hunt, talking about that period. The CIA headquarters, he said, was a tomb. We were doomed. We were getting drunk. We were finished. We didn't even know if we were going to go to prison. If Kennedy survived to 1964, to that election. More than that, Kennedy said, I'm going to end the war in Vietnam. Every American will be out by the end of next year. He didn't say every soldier. The CIA had predated the Green Berets by years. This was their playground, as they used to say during the war. It's a dirty little war, but it's the only one we have. When Kennedy died in this city, less than 100 Americans had died in Vietnam. Now we know the figure is over 58,000. The first shots of that massive land-based war in Southeast Asia were fired here in Dealey Plaza. More than that, Kennedy had embarked upon a program of rapprochement with Fidel Castro. His representative was meeting with Castro at the very time that they together heard that Kennedy had been shot. The CIA wanted, their approach to Castro was a nuclear bomb on Havana. Every single thing Kennedy stood for, the CIA was trying to destroy. It got to a point where Kennedy put together the Mongoose program to put these anti-Castro Cubans in a, as he said, in a cage, keep the animals in the cage. We can control them until after the '64 election. They were at Lake Pontchartrain outside of New Orleans, in camps. Kennedy sent the FBI with guns to confront the CIA representatives with guns. It wasn't a civil war, but it was a nasty standoff because the CIA was not responsive to him. They were doomed. Instead, turns out he was doomed.
You're not just suggesting that it was a bunch of renegade CIA agents. It sounds like you're saying it came from the top.
I don't know if it was the director, but it certainly was the top of the Central Intelligence Agency. Who else could have set this up in Mexico City? Who else could have told Earl Warren what these stories were? Who could have convinced the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who appointed the commission, but before he died said, I never believed that. I always thought there was a conspiracy, and I suspected American intelligence. That's what Lyndon Johnson said before he died. Who else could have convinced the President, the Chief Justice, not some figure in organized crime in New Orleans? They didn't have access to the White House.
You haven't mentioned a specific name within the CIA as the leader of this plot.
There's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, I don't know the name, but there was a letter from J. Edgar Hoover dated November 29th, 1963, which states that there was an interagency intelligence briefing in Dallas here, not in Dallas, about what took place here in Dallas. It took place on November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination, and it was with the man who knew about anti-Castro CIA activities which were authorized. It was about maybe some unauthorized activity will take place. That letter, dated November 29th, says that the CIA representative was Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, Bush has sworn, when he was made director of the CIA in the mid-1970s, he never had any contact with the CIA prior to then. That was not the truth. More than that, the Bay of Pigs, of course, was an operation which had a code name. George Bush came from New Haven down to Midland, Texas, the oil boomtown, formed a partnership with Hugh Leitke. Now, that Pennzoil just gotten his $3 billion judgment, and his partner and his brother, Bill Leitke. They formed a group which George Bush named Zapata Petroleum. That was George Bush's lucky name, Zapata Petroleum. Bush began his normal role as vice president. They hit 72 oil wells in a row. Then Bush moved to Houston, sold his interest, formed a new organization called Zapata Offshore Petroleum, with helicopter pads all over Latin America, Colombia, the Far East, all those places. Then the Bay of Pigs took place. Its code name, known only to a few at that time, was Operation Zapata, and the only two ships which invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs were named Barbara and Houston.
Well, that could be coincidental, right?
Of course. Anything can be coincidental, and that can be coincidental, but I think there's some questions to be asked. I think this country requires no more commissions, no more presidents and vice presidents and future presidents and politicians on commissions. What this country requires is the election of a president who will have the courage to face this, to appoint a special prosecutor, so that that special prosecutor with the powers given to him under the law can present evidence to a grand jury. That's the rule of law in America. The Iran-Contra case was broken when Judge Walsh was made a special prosecutor. That's how we deal with possible crimes in America. Why not with this crime, the most serious crime of the century?
Well, let's see. I guess the last official investigation was the Select Committee
Of the House of Representatives.
in the late 70s.
That's right, and they said there was a 95% probability that there had been a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, called upon the Department of Justice to investigate, and the Department of Justice said, no thank you.
Had you done any petitioning of Congress to do this again?
No.
Why not?
I wrote the legislation which set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and it was a worthwhile endeavor. We have a finding of the Congress which actually reaches into every library in America and stamps void on the Warren Commission report. But now we have to get serious, and we have to go to the rule of law. Congress doesn't investigate crimes ordinarily. They don't have the power. They can't indict. Special prosecutors do that. We have to have a special prosecutor.
Time is getting away from us. We haven't touched on the Lee Harvey Oswald connection. How did he, in your opinion, get involved in all this?
He believed he was working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and maybe he was. Wagner Carr told the Warren Commission, Wagner Carr was the Attorney General of Texas at the time, that Oswald was an employee of the FBI, and the FBI number assigned to him was either S-172 or S-179. That's the information that he had. I think Oswald did believe he was working for the FBI, which means it was very simple for them to move him from one place to another. He didn't fire any shots. The paraffin gas test taken by the Dallas Police Department of his face was negative, which meant he had not fired a rifle that day. He was carried before the police on numerous occasions, and after he'd been questioned for 12 hours, a reporter said, "What's your response to being charged with killing the president?" And he said, "The president? No one's even asked me about that." They said, you have been charged." And then he looked as if he understood it all. It's all on television, all on tape. And he said, "Well, then I'm the patsy." And he was right. That was his role.
Well, I've got a lot more questions to ask you, but I think we need to take our final break a little early, and then we'll come back and do that. We'll be back in just a moment. Mr. Lane, as I recall, Lee Harvey Oswald went to work for the Texas School Book Depository in early October of '63.
Yes.
Also, as I recall, the route for the parade was not set until quite some time after that. How do you square this with his being a patsy in all this?
Well, who set the route? The brother of one of the leaders of the CIA who had been fired by President Kennedy. That's part of it. I don't think we know all the details. We could have learned a lot from Oswald, but he was shot to death in the basement of the Dallas Police and Courts building, not by the critics of the Warren Commission, but by Jack Ruby, while he was surrounded and being protected by Dallas police officers. Then Ruby testified before the Warren Commission, Volume 5. Only 2 members of the commission were present, Gerald Ford and Earl Warren. And Ruby said, "You're questioning me here with the police present." The question was he involved in a conspiracy with the police to kill Oswald? And he said, "Take me out of here. I can't talk with them there." This is the record. "I can't talk with them there. Take me to Washington. I will tell you everything. My life is not safe if I talk to you here. There was a great conspiracy. I can give you all of the details. Take me to Washington. I will give them to you." The Chief Justice, charged by the President with getting all of the facts, turned to Jack Ruby and said, "If you feel your life is in danger, I would advise you not to say any more now. We have to have lunch and we're going back to Washington, so thank you very much." That basically was the testimony of Jack Ruby. After he had silenced the only witness who could have answered these important questions that you're asking and that all of America was asking. Who was Oswald? Why was he there? What was he doing? What did he mean? He was the patsy. Those are relevant questions. Oswald had been questioned for 12 and a half hours by 7 agents of the FBI who never tape recorded a word and never took any notes about what he said. They knew who he was. Roger Craig, a Dallas deputy sheriff, told me and we have it filmed, that he came into the offices of the police department and saw Oswald at that point sitting back in a chair with his feet on the desk, as if he was one of the boys and he was just waiting for the problems to be resolved. There are a lot of questions about Oswald. I don't have the answers because Jack Ruby, who had been a figure for organized crime in a murder in 1939 in Chicago, was allowed to go in there and kill him. In fact, when Jimmy Hoffa took over the Teamsters Union by moving from Detroit to Chicago, and Robert Kennedy in 1960 wrote a book about it called The Enemy Within, he said it was done by a murder in Chicago in 1939 of Leon Cook. The front page of the Chicago Tribune has a picture of Jack Ruby and says he was seized by the Chicago police and charged with that murder. And yet he waltzes into the Dallas police station with a gun and killed Oswald.
With the compliance of the Dallas police, is that what you're saying?
No, I don't know that. I do know that Ruby wanted to give the answer to that question to Earl Warren and Gerald Ford, and they refused to listen.
Very briefly, it's pretty well documented that you say Ruby waltzed into the police department, that before he waltzed in, about 3 or 4 minutes before he waltzed into the police department, he was down the block sending a telegram at Western Union.
Right.
Awfully close timing there, if there was some kind of conspiracy or plot involved.
Oh, not really. When Ruby arrives, you bring Oswald in. Doesn't make a difference when he gets there. The show doesn't go on until the star arrives. Everyone thought the star was Lee Harvey Oswald. Perhaps some people knew the star was Jack Ruby. Listen to the tape. There were police vehicles down there. It is not until Oswald is brought down that you hear a beep on a horn. And then when he's brought right in front of Ruby, there's another beep and then the shots are fired. I don't know what took place that day. Ruby is dead. He wasn't allowed to talk. Oswald was murdered by Ruby. Doesn't this raise questions in anyone's mind about what happened? The most important aspect of the cover-up was the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. Had Oswald lived, this matter would have been resolved in a trial. He didn't live for the trial. Why?
You say you've written the last word, your last word on the assassination. Why?
Plausible Denial is my report to the American people about who killed their president. It is now, I think, a responsibility of all of us in this country to see to it that the president appoints a special prosecutor and does what has to be done. Submit this. If a dog was run over in Dealey Plaza, there would have been the ordinary rule of law. Maybe a ticket would have been given. Maybe a trial in a court someplace. This was the president. There's never been anything that looks like the rule of law applying, and it has to take place now. And I tell you, if I can, one last thing.
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Okay.
I wish we had the time. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Washington attorney and Kennedy assassination investigator Mark Lane, author of a newly published book, Plausible Denial. Was the CIA involved in the assassination of JFK? Thanks for joining us on Point of View.
This has been Point of View, a public affairs presentation of KDFW TV.